Hey guys, before we get started, I just wanted to make a quick mention that I noticed, one of the main email addresses I give out if people want to contact me is jonelance@gmail.com. And I was thinking about playing things a little safe and adding an email address, johnelance@gmail.com. And that email address has already been taken. So I'm not necessarily saying there's anything nefarious behind it, but it is a little bit odd that there would be that email address, john at elance@gmail.com. So anyway, if you want to contact me through email or contribute through PayPal, you can do so to jonelance@gmail.com. I also just want to let you guys know, to make it easier, I've set up TheMorgile@gmail.com. So that's another one that you can use for anything, either contacting me, and it's also tied to my PayPal account. And as a matter of fact, I've also recently purchased the domain TheMorgile.com, TheMorgile.net, TheMorgile.org, TheMorgile.us, and I think a couple others. And so I've got plans to have a website put up in the next couple of months. So I have purchased the domain. I need to pay for some web hosting, and I've got a friend that's willing to help. And let's go ahead and get started with the video. What is up, everybody? John the Morgile here for a stationary plane Earth video. The working title of this video is fairly fitting, I hope. The globe is deader than ever, because it seems that all of the popularized curvature calculations of the Earth, which we're all very familiar with now that we've been introduced to the topic of flat Earth, the good old 8 inches per mile squared in terms of the tangent line, your line of sight becoming a tangent to the curve of the Earth, and the Earth should fall away at a rate of about 8 inches per mile squared. And, that's an accurate enough mathematical equation. It certainly works in terms of, say, for example, a side view of a geometrical sort of 2D representation of this line of sight. So you have an observer on one end of the curve, and then a target on the other end of the curve, and of course the spherical Earth, at certain distances should block out or obstruct the visibility of these distant target objects. For example, the thing that you're seeing here, which is the world record long distance landscape photography shot, it's over 273 miles away. And once you've done all of the trigonometry and mathematics to this and applied it to a hypothetically spherical Earth, it shows that the tip top of the tallest mountain should be over a half a mile beneath the curve of the Earth. So in this example, this world record landscape distance photography, which has been the topic of two of my latest flat Earth videos, because it is such a profound piece of evidence showing the Earth to be a plane, what we're actually seeing there is not a mountain that is about, an inch tall. We're seeing a mountain that is 2.5 miles tall, that appears to be very small due to perspective. And so what we're witnessing in reality is we're witnessing the operations of perspective, which happen within the human eye. The actual world doesn't obey the laws of perspective from a third person sort of viewpoint. We can only observe the world around us in perspective due to the nature of our eye. And when distant objects become or when large objects become more and more distant, they apparently diminish in angular size, and our eyes and our brains render that as an apparently smaller and smaller object. That's simply how the operation of perspective works. It's something that happens strictly in the eye of the beholder. It's not something that happens in reality. However, if you are to do, say, a side view curvature calculation or a side view geometrical representation of such a curvature calculation of this world record long distance landscape photography from July 16th of 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Such a side view representation should show the apparent diminution in size of the mountain according to that observer, and it should not show that mountain as being the actual size. And again, the reason being is that observer would witness or would perceive that mountain to diminish in angular size with distance. And if the Earth was a sphere, that mountain would also drop vertically. It would physically descend vertically from that perspective to the point to where the tip top of the tallest peak would be obscured by over a half a mile of the horizon. Now, there are globe Earth clingers and cognitive dissonance dwellers who insist on introducing the idea of standard refraction into such equations, which is patently absurd, because refraction of light is shown to always, as a rule, bend towards the higher density gradient. So light is going to bend, if it's traveling through a medium for long distances, light is going to tend to bend towards the higher density medium. And so this means that the distant peak shown here, if the Earth was a sphere, refraction would not magically raise that mountain up by about 3 miles, so that not only can we see the tip top of it, which should be over a half a mile under the horizon line, but we can also see the entire base of the mountain, more or less, as well as all of the other mountains in that range, which is absolutely 100% impossible if the Earth was a sphere. Now, refraction aside, or even granting refraction to this argument in favor of the globe, which it absolutely would not favor the globe, but even granting that, it would play such a minuscule effect on the grand scheme of this calculation due to the combination of the factors that I've already mentioned, and I briefly mentioned in a previous video. And again, that combination of factors is the apparent diminution in size due to perspective of distant objects, as well as the actual vertical descent of objects proportionally with distance, but only if the Earth was a sphere, of course. So you would have not only the exponential effect of vertical descent due to an object being distant along an inverse square curve, but you would also need to figure in the apparent diminishment in size or angular size according to the observer himself into this equation. And so when you see things like this 273 mile long landscape photography world record, it is absolute 100% irrefutable evidence that the Earth is not spherical. Okay, and anyone that tries to argue against this with things like refraction is just absolutely grasping at straws, trying to maintain their absurd belief system, and are deciding to either dwell in cognitive dissonance, or I do believe that there are a lot of GCHQ J-trig agents who have been inserted into the flat Earth and globe Earth proponent communities in order to distract the conversation and ensure that valuable, indisputable evidence for a stationary plane Earth do not get the amount of coverage that ridiculous, nonsensical claims get. in terms of flat Earth, and this is undeniable. If you just log out of your YouTube account and YouTube search flat Earth and go through the top 20 videos, a lot of the times, maybe 10 or 15 of those videos will be just abject nonsense, poorly done videos that don't, mention anything about the utter lack of curvature of the Earth or the utter lack of motion of the Earth. And, without sounding too judgmental or too prejudiced about, using those sort of statements, flat Earth, the stationary plane Earth, the truth happens to be extremely simplex, very, very simple. And I just find it very unnerving when I see alleged flat Earth proponents making the whole thing seem extremely complex, or turning the flat Earth awakening process into some sort of a silly caricature of what it's actually all about. And if you study history, one of the best ways that the powers which ought not be sully and subvert and co-opt and ruin grassroots movements of the people is by taking control of the conversation and steering it towards the direction of just nonsensical hyperbole and the age-old tactics of a false dichotomy, red versus blue, us versus them. And I just fear that, yes, of course, we have an us versus them mentality against globe Earth proponents, but what I just don't want to see occur is an us versus them in the flat Earth community. Because one thing that all flat earthers have in common, regardless of their personal opinions or views, the thing that we all have in common is that we all know that the Earth isn't a spinning sphere. And so, frankly, it's unnecessary for flat earthers to have a quote-unquote working model of the universe. Frankly, because the heliocentric model does not work. The heliocentric model does not describe observable reality in the slightest. And, I could probably list off 24 examples, but just watch the last 2 years worth of my videos, or plenty of other flat earth content creators' videos. But one of the things that I've really sort of spent a lot of time on is pointing out the obvious contradictions and impossibilities in the heliocentric model, which is as absurd as something like Santa Claus. Because, once you prove lack of curvature and lack of sphericity and complete lack of any sort of motion, be it rotational, orbital, solar orbital, galactic orbital, any sort of motion that is purported to exist in terms of the Earth is just abject nonsense, which can be disproved by countless practical, simple experiments. Then poking holes in the heliocentric model is just, more and more evidence. Because, I'm sorry, the standard accepted model must be exactly as they say, or the whole thing falls apart. And frankly, this is why I don't adhere to any model. There are lots of theoretical projections that make a lot of sense on a flat Earth, whether it's a circular projection like an AE, azimuthal equidistant projection. There's others who have more of a linear projection, which has also been dubbed the diamond projection or the Pac-Man model. And you have even, other things that people purport as models. But The main point that I'd like to make is that flat Earth, the flat stationary Earth, truth, does not need a model in any way, shape, or form. Because you see, the Earth is measurably flat. That is data that cannot be refuted. Furthermore, the Earth is measurably and provably, demonstrably, repeatably stationary. And that data cannot be refuted with. Unfortunately, we're left in a position where we're, and I'll put this in an analogous form, using an analogy, trying to put together a flat Earth model with the current data that we have would be like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle without any of the corner pieces, without any of the edges, also with the, I'll say about 25% of the dead center removed, and also say 3 dozen puzzle pieces that don't even belong to the puzzle at all jumbled together. Now, if you actually think that you'd be able to put together that puzzle, then I'm sorry, but there's absolutely no way you could put together that puzzle. You have to have all the pieces. You have to really have the edges for sure. You definitely have to have the center. That's really just as integral as any of the other puzzle pieces. However, when we're subjected to things like the Antarctic Treaty as well as the Arctic Treaty, then we're effectively kept out away from the edges, regardless of the model you subscribe to, whether it's a globe, whether it's an AE projection, which is not a model, or whether it's more of a linear sort of portal-based Pac-Man, linear sort of thing. The point is when we are not privy to all of the pieces of the puzzle, and there is intentional misdirection that is inserted into this quest for truth, it makes it very, very difficult. Now, for globe earthers to claim that flat earthers, for some reason, need to come up with a working model of flat Earth is just outright preposterous, because if I haven't mentioned this already, the heliocentric model completely fails to describe observable reality. Off the top of my head, I'll give you just a few examples. If you've ever witnessed the full moon during broad daylight, many hours after sunrise or many hours before sunset, through the high noon, if you've ever seen the full moon during the broad daylight, then you have proven that the heliocentric model is wrong, because the full moon should strictly be on the complete opposite side of the spherical Earth. Let's see, about 238,000, well, plus the 8,000 mile hypothetical diameter of the Earth, 246,000 miles under your feet, and yet we can see the full moon overhead during broad daylight. So that one point alone completely refutes the heliocentric model, hands down. There's absolutely no argument against it in a heliocentric theory. On the other side of that spectrum, the crescent-shaped moons, or the no moon, which you can't really see, but let's just say a 3% crescent moon, should strictly be aligned to the day side of the Earth. And so if you have ever seen, which we've all seen many times, a crescent-shaped moon many hours after sunset, then that is also proof against the heliocentric layout, as the crescent-shaped moons should strictly be a daytime phenomenon, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't understand the heliocentric model. Another example would be the fact that the North Star Polaris has remained 90 degrees overhead the apparent alleged axis of rotation. So, in other words, it's always been the central star in the north. It's been so for my entire life. It's been so for as long as my grandfather lived. And his grandfather would have told him if the North Pole Star Polaris had ever changed. And as a matter of fact, if you go to ancient Roman language, the word for Polaris is Polaris. And so there is no evidence that the North Pole Star has ever moved. Now, the reason that this is a complete debunk of the heliocentric model has to do with something called precession of the equinoxes. And I've covered this in videos, but essentially what it is the precession of the equinoxes is a slow regression in the background stars in front of which the sun rises on the vernal equinox. So it's an annual observation that was originally made by Hipparchus, the ancient Greek, and was carried on and followed up on by Ptolemy, who realized that the constellation which backdropped the rising sun on the vernal equinox was more or less changing very, very slowly. Hipparchus estimated it at a rate of 1 degree per 100 years, and Ptolemy corrected that through further observation that it was 1 degree every 72 years. And that makes sense because the whole thing is a 26,000 year cycle. Now, in the heliocentric model, the alleged cause for precession of the equinoxes, which is an observable phenomenon, and by the way, we are traversing from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, which we actually recently did. And it is fairly interesting since the age of Aquarius is associated with, at least in an occult sense, with an outpouring of knowledge or revelation, if you will. So that is sort of interesting. However, that is where we get those ages, the ages of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. And again, this is a 26,000 year cycle that is observable, even over a lifetime. Over 72 years, if you observe the sunrise on the vernal equinox, you'll notice that it will have slowly changed by allegedly 1 degree in terms of the background constellation which it rises in front of. Now, this phenomenon is allegedly caused by something called axial precession of the globe. And what axial precession is, in a nutshell, it is a wobble of the Earth's axis. And so if you've ever spun a top may spin perfectly, perpendicular for a time, but as it loses momentum, it will start to sort of gyrate or precess, and so the top will be spinning, and yet it will wobble around. And so the precession of the equinoxes is alleged to be caused by the Earth itself acting as sort of a gyroscope in space, and the polar axis is slowly wobbling through this axial precession cycle, which takes 26,000 years and is allegedly causal of the precession of the equinoxes. What I find really quite humorous about all this is the fact that the axis itself, if the Earth was a spinning sphere, would be the most obvious change due to its perfect centrality of all the other stars. And the least obvious change would obviously be that of the equatorial stars in front of which the sun rises on the vernal equinoxes, because you don't have that spinning around the center effect, which I'll just get into in a little bit more detail here in just a minute. If it was actually axial precession causing this phenomenon of precession of the equinoxes, and I'll explain why. It's very simple. Now, this is all according to mainstream accepted hypothetical physics, and the problem with this theory is the observation of the stationary North Pole star Polaris puts this whole heliocentric theory in terms of Polaris into checkmate, because hypothetical globists love to claim that the stars never change their relative alignments due to the vast distances involved, therefore there's no stellar parallax. However, this has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with stellar parallax. What this has to do with is our alleged axis of rotation being pointed perfectly at Polaris for all of my life, which is 36 years, all of my grandfather's life, which he lived in, to be his 90s, and his grandfather's life as well, which, goodness gracious, we're talking, since the 1800s here. And by the way, people who wrote books in the 1865, such as Dr. Robotham wrote Zetetic, also mentioned that Polaris was, the pole star and does not change. Sure, Polaris goes around in a very minor circuit over 24 hours, but it remains central to all the other stars in the sky, and that even counts for, and that even goes for the far southern stars. However, the apparent counter-rotation of the southern stars is 100% adequately explained by atmospheric refraction. However, that is a topic for another discussion. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that the pole star, the North Pole star Polaris, remaining fixed in its essential spot for all of recorded history, shows that the Earth is not a spinning sphere. Because again, the precession of the equinoxes is reliant upon the Earth's axis being on this 26,000 year wobble, which would amount to a 1 degree change in the axis every 72 years. And that isn't just an incremental 72 years tick a degree, 72 years tick a degree. It would be a constant phase shifting out of alignment with Polaris, so that over 36 years, for example, throughout my entire lifetime, there would have been a half a degree of change in terms of the alignment with our alleged axis and Polaris. And not a half a degree in space, but a half a degree in terms of the arc angle of this wobble, although it would be a constant, very obvious change because of the alleged distance involved to Polaris for one, which is allegedly 2.5 quadrillion miles away. So if our measly, wobbly, arbitrary axis, which is not only wobbling every 26,000 years allegedly, but we're also traveling around the sun at a 60-degree angle to the sun's path around the galaxy, which is traveling through space at some other degree to the sun's path. Yeah, it makes perfect sense that a star, the North Pole star, that is allegedly within the quote-unquote Milky Way galaxy would always and forever, or even over the course of 50 years, remain fixed in the same spot overhead of the alleged axis of rotation. This stationary nature relative to all the other stars of Polaris is unique, and it is proof that the heliocentric model is 100% wrong. Now, I'm gonna do an experiment here. Only I'll use a graphical representation of the experiment to show what I'm trying to explain. Now, if you are looking through a scope at a target that's, say, just a mile away, okay? And let's just say that that scope represents the hypothetically spherical Earth's axis of rotation, okay? If your alignment to that relatively distant target, a mile away, that's a pretty good distance. It's nowhere near as distant as 2.5 quadrillion miles away by any stretch. But if, a mile is a good distance for looking at a target through a scope, but since the crosshairs of that scope represents the axis of rotation of the Earth, then we would have to spin we'd have to spin our observer around where the axis of rotation is the dead center crosshairs of that scope. Now, as long as the target is 100% accurately lined up to that scope, to that crosshairs, then that target will appear to be central to everything else in the image. Okay? Now, if you were to misalign that perfect 90-degree alignment to your target through that scope as you're rotating by even just a fraction of a degree, then that central target would lose its central position, and some other object in the distance would become the central point of your rotation, and everything else in the image would appear to rotate around that. And so the point that I'm making here is that if axial precession of the hypothetically spherical, non-spherical Earth was actually spinning upon an axis and keeping the 2.5 quadrillion mile, allegedly, distant Polaris dead on balls in the center of its spinning scope for all of recorded history, then we absolutely cannot say by any stretch of the imagination that the precession of the equinoxes is caused by axial precession. Now, you'll have proponents for scientism, proponents for the globe, as well as flat earthers, alleged flat earthers, telling you that this is a misrepresentation of the heliocentric model, which it absolutely is not. I urge anyone to research the precession of the equinoxes, and then I urge anyone to research the Earth's quote-unquote axial precession. And you will find that the precession of the equinoxes is a 26,000 year cycle. Allegedly, it's never been confirmed. We've only been studying it since about, let's just say, 300 BC at the latest. So we're talking just over 2,300 years in modern terms. So we've studied, less than 10% of this cycle altogether. So we don't know if it's a repeating cycle or what, but, assuming it is a cycle, it absolutely could not be caused by axial precession, because the alignment between the Earth's axis and Polaris would need to be so perfect, especially when you increase the distance, that even a fraction of a degree of change in that alignment while the Earth is allegedly spinning would throw Polaris off of its, or out of its central position to all the other northern stars, very obviously, even over the course of a lifetime, even over the course of my lifetime so far, certainly over the course of the lifetime of somebody who's maybe 60 or 70 years old. And there are people who claim that the North Pole Star changed one time 6,000 years ago. However, this is just absurd, because if you actually look at the data which scientism claims about the precession of the equinoxes, it's very clear that we should be experiencing a 1 degree misalignment of the alleged axis of the Earth every 72 years. And that means that we should have a new North Star every 50 or 100 years at the most. But, of course, throughout history, the single star Polaris, which has throughout history been found by looking at the two lower stars of Ursa Major, which basically point directly to the North Pole Star, that's how Polaris has been found throughout history. So for people to claim that the North Pole Star may have changed once 6,000 years ago, first of all, it's irrelevant, even if that's true, because we're talking about the heliocentric model here. If the heliocentric model were true, we would not have a fixed North Pole Star for any significant duration whatsoever, due to the so-called precession of the equinoxes, which is allegedly caused by axial precession. The reason this is such an incredibly damning piece of evidence against the heliocentric theory is because their own assertions and the own quote-unquote laws of the heliocentric model contradict one another. Again, if we can witness and experience precession of the equinoxes, and that is allegedly caused by the axis of the Earth wobbling over 26,000 years. Now that seems like a long time, and it is definitely, especially in human terms. 26,000 years is a long time, but when you break this down into a per degree basis, it's 1 degree every 72 years. And so if Ptolemy and Hipparchus were able to notice the zodiacal stars changing ever so slightly, which can only be observed once per year on the vernal equinox, in terms of the sun rising in front of Pisces for 2,000 years, and then rising in front of Aquarius for the next couple thousand years or whatever. This is, allegedly something that we can observe over long periods of time and meticulous study and documentation. On the other hand, when you consider the North Pole star Polaris, well, that should be the most obvious indicator of axial precession, because again, we're talking about it being central to all the other stars. And even just a quarter of a degree in change of the Earth's axis, which would take a quarter of 72 years, which would be about 18 years. So over the course of 18 years, the axis of Earth's rotation should have precessed through its wobble a quarter of a degree. And that quarter of a degree of precession through the Earth's wobble, and that's sort of an arc angle of this wobble that you see here, would completely misalign Polaris to the alleged central axis of the spinning spherical Earth, to the point where Polaris would no longer be the central star, even just a quarter of a degree. Now, in my lifetime, I've been around 36 years, I should have witnessed a half a degree of this alleged axial precession. And, since my grandfather was a young lad, over 100 years ago, we should have noticed a full degree of axial precession, meaning our axis should be pointing a full degree in that arc angle of its precession away from where it was, 72 or 100 years ago. And so this is all very excellent proof against the heliocentric model, and yet you will find globe earthers as well as flat earthers, for some reason, who either don't understand the argument or who claim that this is not true and claim that the North Pole star changed once 6,000 years ago. Quite frankly, we should be seeing new North stars very, very frequently. Again, that is according to the heliocentric model, due to this alleged axial precession, which is supposedly causal of the precession of the equinoxes, yet the entire thing is put into checkmate, even handing the globe Earth team axial precession, or precession of the equinoxes, as being a result of the Earth's axial precession. The whole thing is put into checkmate when you run this hypothetical scenario over time, even just 50 years or 72 years. We should see constantly changing North Stars throughout history. Polaris should have been not central to the Earth's alleged axis of rotation even just 100 years ago. 200 years ago, it should have been a completely different star. 300 years ago, 400 years ago, we should see constantly new North Stars. And so for people to claim without any sort of evidence whatsoever that 6,000 years ago the North Pole star changed once, which is just absolutely ridiculous and makes no sense whatsoever considering the heliocentric model and the so-called axial precession, yet people will claim this. quite frankly, without any curvature or motion, the Earth couldn't possibly be a spinning globe. And so every time we scrutinize things or claims or assertions or laws of the heliocentric theory, we always, without fail, find contradictions, misunderstandings, misinterpretations of data due to confirmation bias, philosophically preferred outcomes, ignorance of evidence, ignorance of data, all in the name of preserving a philosophically preferred scientific or lientific model of the universe. And this dates back as far as certainly the Copernican revolution. Certainly dates back to the times when they first started making globes around the year 1500, right after good old Christopher Columbus sailed the oceans blue and accidentally found America when he was looking for the east coast of India. It really goes to show that they did not have a working model of the world right up to the 1500s. So anyone who claims that
everyone knew the Earth was a spinning ball for 2, or some people say 3,000 years
is ridiculous, because, well, for one, the first globes weren't even made until the 1500s after the first so-called east-to-west circumnavigation, which is possible on a plane Earth. Circumnavigation is not exclusive to a sphere, but it was that point in time when the globe Earth theory really took off in terms of being widely accepted. Perhaps, there were ancient Greeks who were kicking the idea around a little bit, 300 BC and such. However, it's not as if this was some widely accepted thing. And in fact, that is proven by the fact that Christopher Columbus himself disagreed with the circumference of the Earth as according to Eratosthenes. It's claimed that Christopher Columbus was looking for a shortcut by sticking to northern latitudes, but of course it is also claimed, and it makes sense, that he believed that the hypothetically spherical Earth was much smaller than Eratosthenes believed. If you do look this up historically, there is some debate as to whether or not Columbus disagreed with Eratosthenes' alleged hypothetical value of the spherical Earth's circumference, or whether he was trying to merely find a shortcut by sticking to the far north as much as possible. And of course, in a flat Earth sort of circular layout hypothesis, the shortcut from any point to point, unless you're talking about a straight line, of course, but the shortcut from any east to west destination is going to be adhering to the north as much as possible, because whenever you stray south, especially considering it an AE projection, then you are getting further and further away from the center. You're getting further and further away from everything, and your east to west journey is necessarily going to be a longer arc if you're following magnetic north in order to discern east and west, which are right angles to magnetic north according to, AE projection sort of layout, as well as, pretty much any projection. If north is to your right, and you're walking with a compass and north is to your right, then you're heading west. And that's true whether the Earth is spherical or flat or triangular or trapezoidal or Pac-Manozoidal. No offense to the linear model proponents, but I would just say that I am a proponent for no model other than the absolutely demonstrable model that the Earth is not a spinning sphere. And I really, really love and enjoy showing all of the contradictions and inconsistencies and impossibilities in the heliocentric model, which is believed. That means believing without any evidence. It's believed by the majority of the world, including those who call themselves scientists and are indeed lientists. So what I'm trying to show here with this azimuthal equidistant projection, this AE projection, is first of all, I must say that the AE projection is not a model. It's not a flat Earth model, just as a Mercator projection is not a globe Earth model. The Mercator projection shows the equator as being representative of a 25,000 mile latitude line. However, on the Mercator projection, the, say, 90-degree north latitude, which is supposedly a single point on the top of the globe, is also represented as a line amounting to 25,000 miles. So the Mercator projection shows an instance of the Earth where the north and south polar areas are stretched to infinity and are represented by lines that are equal in length in terms of the equator. So the Mercator projection is not a model, and for me to hypothetically go around showing flight distances on a Mercator projection and saying that they're impossible on a spherical Earth is akin to people on the globe Earth team pointing to the azimuthal equidistant projection and saying that certain flights are impossible on a flat Earth, or even I think even more ignorantly stating things like the sun can or can't do this or that upon a flat Earth. So again, back to the puzzle analogy, we don't have all the edges and we don't have the central pieces, and we've been deliberately fed misinformation, so we've been given false puzzle pieces to really confuse us. But one thing that we can all certainly agree on is that the Earth isn't a sphere and that it isn't spinning around in space. And so in that regard, what I'm trying to show with this azimuthal equidistant projection is that while the shortest distance between 2 points is always going to be a straight line, obviously, if you're traveling between two relatively far south areas, um, it's actually a shortcut to adhere to the north. Now, if the Earth was a sphere, this should apply equally to the northern hemisphere as it does to the southern hemisphere. And if you just look at any uh, common flight paths, 99% of all flights, even from southern destination to southern destination, wind up going into the northern hemisphere for the first leg of their journey. There are very, very, very few flights that even claim to adhere to the far southern hemisphere, and those flights are very expensive, and there are people who claim to have been on those flights. However, I've never been on those flights, and frankly, it's sort of a straw man argument because, again, the issue with the azimuthal equidistant projection is well known. If you try to, say, take this long arc, this east to west arc, or even the straight line chord to that arc between, say, the south tip of Australia or New Zealand to the south tip of South America, that sort of east to west measurement using an AE projection is preposterous. That's completely incorrectly using that projection of the map. That, again, it would be like me drawing a line in the far south. Let's just say that it's 1 full degree of latitude at the, say, 89 degrees south. That would be represented on a Mercator projection as the exact same distance as a degree of latitude at the equator. And so if I were to start making measurements on the Mercator projection and saying, see, Globers think that it's 1,000 miles or whatever the distance is from these 2 points in the 89 degrees south, when of course, according to the sphere, that should only be maybe a few feet, right? Because again, the 90 degree south and 90 degree north latitudes are allegedly stretched to infinity horizontally across the top and bottoms of the Mercator projection. And similarly, the further you get from the central point of any AE projection, and whether that central point is the North Pole, which is usually how you'll see it presented, which makes some degree of sense, seeing how the North Pole star Polaris remains central, 90 degrees overhead of the central north. It does make a lot of sense to assume that the north is in the center. Furthermore, we know for a fact that the far southern latitudes, so let's just even say 45 degrees south latitude, is far wider around than the 45 degree north latitude. This has been shown countless times. Furthermore, I think that far northern circumnavigation, or east to west navigation in the northern hemisphere, is very commonplace, and even equatorial circumnavigation is commonplace, especially after the advent of the Panama Canal, which cuts off a huge shortcut in terms of skipping the entire, southern peninsula of South America. And so the problem is that far south, east to west circumnavigation is something that has been sort of abandoned for the last several hundred years, and especially abandoned since the Antarctic Treaty, because it is literally illegal for sovereign people, free people, to attempt to circumnavigate the 60 degrees south latitude or further south. And this becomes evident when you see public congratulations and public world records being broken by the likes of Fedor Konyakov, who is touted as holding a world record for quote-unquote circumnavigating the South Arctic in terms of an east to west circumnavigation around the South Arctic. However, if you study the story whatsoever, you'll realize that he broke a record of being the first person to circumnavigate entirely south of the 45 degree south latitude. Now, if you listen to his own account of the journey, he says that he spent the majority of his time in the 40s and 50 degree latitudes, meaning that he must have obeyed the laws of the Antarctic Treaty and didn't even approach the 60 degree south latitude, and certainly did not go any further south than 60 degrees south. And so the claim that the Antarctic has been circumnavigated east to west, and using proof like the Antarctica Cup Challenge and Fedor Konyakov, is absolutely out of favor with the globe. In fact, Fedor Konyakov is a several-time competitor of the so-called Antarctica Cup Challenge, which happens periodically, and the Antarctica Cup Challenge adheres to the 45 degrees south as much as possible. They only go south whenever necessary, so as to avoid, the southern continents, but other than that, they remain above the 45 degrees south latitude. So to call the Antarctica Cup Challenge a east to west circumnavigation of the South Arctic Circle is preposterous, since again the South Arctic Circle is around 65, 66 degrees south. So, the whole rigmarole about Fedor Konyakov, and I did a video mentioning this before, breaking records and circumnavigating the Antarctic, is just preposterous nonsense that isn't even, they don't even lie about it in the media. They just straight up tell the truth, but they tell it in such a way, they sensationalize the title, and they insinuate certain things. But if you actually read what's said by the man himself who did the journey, he spent the majority of his time in the 40s, 50s south, and probably did not even approach the 60 degrees south. And if he did, he didn't do it for long. Otherwise, he would have been in violation of the Antarctic Treaty. And so, again, without the edges of the puzzle, it's very difficult for us to have a quote-unquote working flat Earth model. And again, it is quite unnecessary because in order for the Globe Earth team to have any sort of standing in this conversation, they first must show absolute concrete evidence of Earth curvature, which does not exist, and they also must show absolute verifiable concrete evidence that the Earth is in constant supersonic motion in terms of axial rotation at the equator, as well as constant hypersonic or hyperludicrous speed motion in terms of the alleged nonsensical preposterous orbit around the sun, and the sun's even further more ridiculous alleged orbit around the galactic center. By the way, our alleged orbit is offset to the sun's alleged orbit by 60 degrees, and the galactic center itself is also traveling in some direction divergent from the path of the sun itself. So all of this wild, just unfathomable, conflicting motions of all these different orbiting bodies going around inverse square curves through infinite space-time, never existing in the same place twice, is just the most bizarre theory that we were convinced existed since we were young enough to believe in things like the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and we were afraid of things like goblins under our bed. That's about as young as they got us with this whole just absurd and beyond asinine theory that we all live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere in the vacuum of infinite space theory. Getting back to the whole idea about maps and models and geodetic surveying only occurring in the northern hemisphere throughout history, Mercator projections, azimuthal equidistant projections. One thing that I think is really worth mentioning is the fact that prior to the 1500s, prior to the discovery of the Americas, so to speak, mariners and travelers, world travelers, had maps that worked, although their model was totally wrong. They were missing a good chunk of the model. So their maps certainly worked, even though they were missing the entire American continents. And so for people to say that maps must be 100% accurate representations of the face of the Earth in order to work is preposterous, especially considering maps worked throughout all of modern history up to the point to where they discovered the American continents. Then the maps had to be rewritten, but even when they were missing about a quarter of the Earth's face, their maps worked. So it just proves the point that we don't have to have necessarily a accurate, complete, working image of the entire face of the Earth in order to have working maps. That's the point. And finally, one more example that I'll give as to why the heliocentric model falls flat on its face is the fact that we're expected to believe that the upper atmosphere, upper plane, exists adjacent to a low pressure or a very low pressure system. You could call it a nearly perfect vacuum. And according to basic fundamental 101 laws of fluid dynamics, you simply cannot have a pressurized system such as the Earth exist adjacent to a low pressure system that happens to be hypothetically, theoretically infinite. And this is regardless of the theory of gravity. Gravity has been debunked. Gravity does not exist. What goes up must come down sure is a true thing. Nobody's arguing that. But what isn't true is that gravity is a warping of space-time by the spherical Earth. Because for one thing, space-time is a theory, and for another thing, the Earth doesn't have curvature. Okay? So how could a stationary plane be warping space-time that doesn't exist and flying through space? Right? So what goes up must come down. makes perfect logical sense on the true flat Earth reality with or without a flat Earth model. Now, on the other hand, what goes up must come down on a spherical Earth hypothesis is really quite an absurd notion if you think about it for 10 seconds objectively and skeptically. Imagine yourself spinning on a merry-go-round. If you were to, and you're riding one of those horsies, right? If you were to throw a tennis ball out and away from the center of that merry-go-round, do you honestly think that that tennis ball would continue spinning around the axis with you after you threw it out and away from the center? Of course not. It's going to travel at 90 degrees to the axis of rotation. That's how that sort of thing works. And so for people, most people, to somehow think that what goes up must come down is even possible upon a spinning sphere Earth in the vacuum of space, let alone many people think that gravity is somehow exclusive to a spinning sphere in outer space, is, to me, I hate to say this, but it is hilarious. I have sort of a dark sense of irony, and I really do feel bad for people who are deceived. But many of those who are deceived are extremely difficult to deal with. They're extremely closed-minded. And quite frankly, what goes up must come down is perfectly explained on the flat, stationary Earth by the laws of density and buoyancy, and is ultimately governed by the only natural force, which is the electromagnetic force. All of the other so-called natural forces of scientism, which are the strong nuclear, the weak nuclear, the gravitic, and of course the electromagnetic forces, the first three are fictitious theoretical forces which do not exist, and the electromagnetic force is the only force in existence. So all forms of matter, frequency, and energy are in one way or another inherently connected to electromagnetic phenomenon. At least that is my personal opinion based on a couple years of research. So for example, sound waves are a specific range of the electromagnetic frequency spectrum. Light waves are obviously a specific range of the electromagnetic frequency spectrum. I would say the idea of pure energy, if there is such a thing, is a specific frequency or range of the electromagnetic spectrum. I would say that even physical matter has nothing to do with theoretical atoms and theoretical subatomic particles and theoretical microgravity. I would say that it makes much more sense that physical matter is adherent to waveforms, which are the higher dimensional constructs that manifest physical three-dimensional objects in reality. See, I used to think the complete opposite way. I used to think that physical material was built by small physical particles that were held together by bonds, and those bonds were a secondary feature of that object, whether it's a hunk of metal or a wooden table. I always felt that the bonds between, the microscopic particles were a secondary feature or a symptom of the solid state of energy. However, now I've sort of changed my outlook to lean towards the idea that everything is energy. Everything is more or less electromagnetic spectrum based. Everything from sound to light to physical matter, and even our souls. Our bodies are certainly susceptible and reliant upon electromagnetic frequencies and electromagnetic phenomenon. But of course, the whole idea of gravity and atomic theory has done absolutely nothing, except for propagandize the world into all sorts of fear porn so that people would hand over their rights to the government and hand over their decision-making processes to scientism. So, for example, when the governments colluded, and you can say it was the US and Russia and possibly even the Nazis, because they were part of the whole nuclear bombs armament race back in the World War II days. When the nuclear bombs were propagandized to the American people as essentially an end of the world scenario device that could go off at any moment, and they were taught to duck under their desks, and they were given daily, if not weekly, propaganda videos about how they could all die at any moment. And that fear porn regarding nuclear hoaxes continued right up through, the era of Ronald Reagan. When I was young and growing up, there was always that sort of thing in the back of your mind where you were led to believe subliminally through the media that, if a few of the wrong people, and George W. Bush as president certainly was not comforting, but if a few of the wrong people hit a couple of the wrong buttons, the entire world could be destroyed, right, through nukes. But when you learn that nuclear bombs are a deception, there's so much evidence to back that claim, and that's a whole nother topic. But when you realize that nuclear bombs are a deception, hot atomic fusion, which is allegedly what's going on inside of stars, is a deception. It's merely theoretical, just like fission or nuclear bombs is theoretical. The only thing nuclear that is real is nuclear power, and that really has nothing to do with nuclear theory or atoms or nuclei at all. All that's going on in terms of nuclear power is it is taking advantage of radioactive isotopes. You encase a enriched radioactive isotope into a small container, and that generates heat. That heat is used to boil water, and that water is used to turn with steam to turn a turbine, and that turbine generates electricity. So you literally have steam power. Nuclear power is steam power, where the energy source is not shoveling coal, it's merely taking advantage of an enriched radioactive isotope. It has nothing to do with splitting of atoms or joining of atoms, or it doesn't prove any sort of atomic theory or subatomic theory whatsoever. However, I believe that the terminology nuclear power and the obvious uses of it, nationwide and worldwide, are specifically there to lend credence to the idea of nuclear fission in terms of bombs and hot atomic fusion in terms of stars. But those two things are theoretical, do not exist, just like atoms, electrons, protons, and neutrons are theoretical and do not exist. Only in the minds and the imaginations of theoretical physicists do such things exist. One thing that I noticed while I was making this video is these, you can see these cameramen here who are allegedly filming a nuclear bomb. Now, you see this huge nuclear bomb, which you just saw there, then it cuts to this explosion that's obviously not a nuclear bomb, then it pans over to these guys, and this is in super slow motion. They're only there for maybe 3 to 5 seconds max, and it pans over to them, showing that, these are the guys that are filming the nuclear bomb. And so we'll play it again, the first instant, and I'll catch a screen capture of it. So this image here is obviously taken from either a helicopter or an airplane far off using telescopics, and that blast appears to be, tons and tons of TNT or equivalent, which is how they used to and still measure the potency or the magnitude of an atomic bomb, is by its equivalency in tons of TNT. So a 1 megaton nuke is, I think it's 1 million or 1,000 tons of TNT. A 100 megaton is some, hundreds of thousands or millions of tons of TNT. But at any rate, that's how they gauge nuke bombs. And so that what they are showing you is this first frame, it's literally like 2 frames. They're showing you this obviously very massive blast, and anybody standing within a few miles of that is going to be in that shockwave. And then they cut to that, and this is again only just a few frames. They cut to this, which is obviously a different blast, and then they pan over to these guys. It appears that they're maybe, I don't know, they couldn't be any more than 20 miles away, I don't think, at the max. And it appears that they're using a bit of trick photography. There's no telling how far away this observer is if they're using telescopics. And there's no telling to what lengths they'd go to fake this sort of thing. The observer filming this could be feet away or a mile away from these guys. But you notice again that first blast, and then they cut, and this is official military propaganda. Then they cut to that, and then they pan over to these guys, and we're expected to believe that they're standing there just out in the open filming a nuclear bomb that honestly, I don't even think it appears to be 20 miles away. It appears to be a few miles away because it's trick photography. They show you this massive blast, then they cut to this, which is a much smaller blast, obviously. And it seems like they're even using double exposure there to give some illusion. Then they pan over, and if you just sort of try to keep the frame of reference, you're looking at bushes and stuff that's, I don't know. I wouldn't even call that more than 10 miles. I think you could walk from where those guys are standing to where that blast, not this blast, but this blast, which are, they're cut together to insinuate it's the same blast. But you could walk from here to where these guys are coming up here, wherever they are. There they are. I'd say within an hour. You could walk there in an hour. And so I just wanted to point this out because I was running this stuff in slow motion and I noticed these guys. Again, I'll run it in full motion one more time so you can see how fast this actual clip is, and then we'll get right back into it. I just thought it was kind of amusing, and when I play this full speed, you won't notice the cuts, and you may not even notice the guys standing there with the camera, but to me it is rather funny. Well, I guess not funny, but amusing that people actually bought this. Yeah, nuclear bomb proof cameras and cameramen. Great. I will not say that I would be surprised if some government in the world, and I won't name any names, or some coalition of governments in the world, I wouldn't put it past them to bury, say, hundreds or thousands of tons of TNT or equivalent. You've got explosives that are, lighter and more efficient than TNT. But I wouldn't put it past certain government coalitions or black budget projects that technically don't exist, sort of deal, to actually bury, thousands of tons of TNT underneath a major city. And then they would claim that it was one of these infamous suitcase nuclear bombs, which is just absurd. But honestly, I would not put it past certain governments to do this. And so, if in our lifetimes we see, any sort of event where a quote unquote nuclear bomb attack goes off, obviously nuclear bombs do not exist, so it would have to be some pre planned, long term pre planned false flag event in order to kick off, well, we're already in World War III, but to officially kick off the worst of World War III. whenever that occurs, if ever that occurs, but it's almost destined to happen because we know that the governments of the world use false flag operations all the time in order to get the public sympathy or the public backing and the public outrage necessary to wage and win a war. If you read the ancient Chinese masters' book, The Art of War, one of the key things in the art of war, and I think that this is still applicable today, is the fact that wars cannot be won without the 100% backing and support of the people at large. It's just a rule of thumb with war, it would appear, that you have to have the consent and the backing and the love of the people, of the nation. And so that's why the United States government has used false flag incidents for as long as it's been in existence. Uh, Look at the Boston Tea Party. Look at the Maine and Spain, which gave the pretext for World War One. Look at the Pearl Harbor incident, which was a false flag that gave the pretext for World War Two. Look at the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never happened, but it was a false flag to give us the pretext for the Vietnam War. Let's look at, probably there's something similar with the Korean War, but definitely 9/11 was the pretext for the never ending war that we're still experiencing on terror. War on a concept, which is obviously never going to be won. And I'm just going on the record here stating that while nuclear weapons do not exist, the government or certain governments or military industrial complex agencies certainly have access to thousands of tons or probably even millions of tons of TNT or equivalent. And they have the ability to drill underground very efficiently, and they have the ability to place many, many tons of high explosives underneath a city or underneath a heavily populated area in order to A, legitimize nuclear weapons, which we all know don't exist. However, it would legitimize them in the eyes of the public, and it would also put everyone in the world in a state of fear porn. And they could possibly do this across cities nationwide or worldwide simultaneously to make it seem like there's rampant suitcase bomber threat. And if that ever does happen, then guess what? We are under the complete articles of martial law, and it may be too late to prevent something like this because our governments, our inept, corrupt governments, have been allowed to continue on status quo with impunity. So the entire point that I was making with this is the fact that the heliocentric team has had 500 years to come up with all sorts of just nonsensical theory, which they put into textbooks and they teach people as fact. And those people piggyback on these nonsensical theoretical conjectures as settled science in order to continue making this heliocentric model, which doesn't work in any way, shape, or form. And so the final example is they claim that stars are made of hot atomic fusion, which is a process that can't be demonstrated in a lab. It's theoretical. They claim that's what's going on inside of stars. But of course, nobody's ever going to go to a star and scoop up a sample and verify that's what's going on. And in fact, nobody on the ground, with all of our infinite scientific wisdom, can create even a microgram of hot atomic fusion. And I would say that is because you can't create something that doesn't exist. That's why you can't, actually plant Jack's beanstalk beans and expect a physical, literal tree to the giant's realm to pop up. Atomic theory is as absurd as theoretical astrophysics theory. and they're very much married to one another, and they have all of these preconceived notions about completely conjecturous theoretical things that are based on confirmation bias as well as philosophical preference, including the theory of the Big Bang, the theory of space time, the theory of gravity, the theory of a spherical Earth, the theory of a spinning Earth, the theory of a heliocentric model where the spinning Earth is orbiting the Sun, the theory of a galaxy where the Sun is orbiting the galaxy, and finally the theory of the galaxy flying through space some millions of miles per hour. In order to be a ball Earth believer, you must believe in all of that and much, much more ridiculous nonsense in order to adhere to your belief system. And while I do understand whenever this topic is first presented to people, the knee jerk reaction is complete incredulity. You think the person delivering the message is crazy, science denying, have some sort of motive to trick people. However, the fact that the Earth is a stationary plane is one of the most obvious, simple truths which anyone can verify, but unfortunately, it is one of the most heavily indoctrinated deceptions which has been ingrained into our collective culture since we were toddlers for at least the last 400 or 500 years, ostensibly. So, those were just a few examples of why the heliocentric model doesn't work. I could give you a couple more. One would be that equatorial stars overhead during the summer on the hypothetically spherical Earth should be on the complete opposite end of the universe compared to equatorial stars or non-polar stars overhead during the winter. And the same thing can be said about spring and autumn. And so, in other words, we should have a complete unique set of stars for each season, especially when talking about stars overhead of the equator. Yet, we can see all of the same stars from somewhere on Earth all year long. And if you can see one single constellation that is an equatorial constellation from winter to summer, from any position on Earth, then the heliocentric model categorically falls apart yet again. So that's just a few things. I'll put some cards and links and stuff so you can check out some of my other videos if you're new to this. But the debate's over. There is no debate. The Earth has been shown so many different ways. It's like ridiculous to be not a spinning sphere by any stretch of the imagination. Yet we're stuck with trying to deal with people's knee-jerk reaction, which I'm guilty of it too. You know, everybody is. When we first hear this topic, we think it's the ridiculous thing we've ever heard. And so we reject it and we consider whomever is presenting that information to us must be, uh, you know, deficient in some way. And so we have to give people time in that respect. We can't shove it down their throats. But at the same time, when you have people, and I won't say any names, but there's lots of people who have been, fairly high profile globe Earth trolls. And that's exactly what they are. You know, if somebody spends 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year trolling flat Earth comments threads, as well as live stream chat threads, that is the sign of an obsession. It's not a sign of somebody trying to be scientific or objective or intellectually honest at all. You cannot argue against raw data. This would be like debating the number of teeth a horse has and then going and counting the teeth of a horse and disagreeing with that data because it disagreed with your initial estimation of a horse's teeth, which, of course, the actual counting of the teeth is what matters. And so, in the same sense, regardless of what is purported or postulated or theorized in either a globe Earth sense or a flat Earth sense, is frankly irrelevant until we're able to count the horse's teeth, so to speak. And so, frankly, I've made this analogy a few times, but I really want to get this on the record. Flat earthers are expected to somehow come up with a coherent working model of the entire universe. When we've only been at this collectively really for the last couple years, maybe 5 years at the very most in terms of specific people. But in terms of the burgeoning flat Earth movement in its current sort of state, it's been really, really getting popular for the last couple of years, and scientism, or the religion of science, or the religion or dogmas involving a spinning spherical earth, have been around for about 500 years or so, if we can believe modern history, which is where, Christopher Columbus, made his second trip to America and basically raped, pillaged, murdered, and all that good stuff. But the point is, according to modern history, it was around, the 1500s, after the, late 1400s, early 1500s. That was when the first globes would have necessarily been made. And I think that an extremely understated point that needs to be made is the fact that astronomers and pretty much all of the constellations that have been around since ancient civilizations like the Sumerians, Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of the different degrees of longitudes from different latitudes were meticulously measured in the northern hemisphere, as pretty much as a rule throughout history. That includes even the Chinese astronomers. And so it wasn't until much, much later on, it seems, when the Holy Roman Empire invaded the far South American culture, which included, I guess you could say, a portion of the Maya territories or something similar, where that was also a very, very old civilization, it seems, maybe as old as or older than the ancient Chinese civilization. Perhaps they had been studying the southern hemisphere stars, or the measurement of different degrees of longitudes from different southern latitudes for, centuries, if not longer. And perhaps that is why we saw the essentially commandeering, at least, and possibly decimation of the knowledge of the South American ancient cultures by the Holy Roman Empire. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that while very meticulous geodetic surveying has been done in the northern hemisphere to get very accurate measurements of different degrees of longitudes at different latitudes. So, like, for example, what is the distance of a degree of latitude from 45 north? Or what is the distance between 2 degrees of longitude at 30 degrees north? All of those measurements appear to have been made meticulously throughout history in the northern hemisphere, pretty much exclusively, with a few exceptions. But what it seems is that since the southern hemisphere, for lack of a better word, you could call it the southern hemisplane, or maybe outer semiplane, depending on what sort of matrix you're humoring. But it appears that the far south has never really truly been fully scaled geodetic surveyed. And I've mentioned this before, but in the late 1400s or early 1500s, once it was established sort of ipso facto, according to all of the mainstream press propaganda in the form of repetition, 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 and of course propaganda in the form of highly esteemed so-called experts purporting theoretical ideas as scientific fact. And then the nail in the coffin for the truth at the time in the 1500s or so would have been the royalty, which always leads back to the so-called Holy Roman Empire, whether it's the Spanish royalty who commissioned Cristobal Colon or whatever. But it always comes back to this royalty, royal astronomical societies, and of course the Jesuits and the Vatican, who are essentially synonymous with royalty. They're in bed together, more or less, if not literally, who throw a bunch of money at the so-called scientists of the day to provide them with a living in order to research and be proponents for often ridiculous theory. A good example would be Einstein's version of reality. The same exact sort of thing happened with Einstein's version of reality, relativity, space time, gravity, etc. We saw the same sort of thing in a more modern sense there, I believe, as the general public would have seen once Cristobal Colon or Christopher Columbus allegedly circumnavigated the flat Earth. If it would have been purported through all of the royal and mainstream outlets, however they disseminated information most efficiently back then, I guess it would have been through things like letters and physical meetings of people and lectures, and of course taught in all of the schools. That's probably the biggest one, that the circumnavigation done by Columbus was automatic exclusive proof to a spherical Earth. And so I think that's exactly what happened once this circumnavigation feat was done. However, what they really ended up doing was a huge failure in terms of the scientific method, because in circumnavigating the world and assuming it's a sphere, they just took a major shortcut, and instead of measuring all of the different degrees of longitudes at different latitudes in the south, they merely rubber stamped, clone stamped, or copy and pasted the respective values from the north. So, for example, from the 15-degree north longitude, we know that 1 degree of latitude is 58 nautical miles or 67 statute miles, and that is by direct measurement. Furthermore, 30 degrees northern longitude, 1 degree of latitude is 52 nautical miles or about 60 statute miles. At 45 degrees north, it's 42 nautical miles per degree of latitude or 48 statute. 60 north is 30 nautical miles, is 1 degree of latitude. 75 north is 16 nautical miles per 1 degree. And 85 north, well into the Arctic Circle, almost to the,
top of the sphere.
uh, 1 degree of latitude at 85 north is about 5 nautical miles, or about 6 statute miles. And so, since all of these measurements were done over time, over the history of modern civilization, in terms of the far northern latitude rings, if you will, it has been fairly well documented throughout history that the lines of longitude converge to a point in the central north. This does appear to be viable and verifiable. I mean, of course, I've never left the United States, but there does appear to be very good evidence for a central north, including one big thing would be the North Pole star Polaris, of course, amongst other things, such as the fact that magnetic compasses always tend towards the north, so they're aligned to the magnetic field of the Earth, which is drawing, or the compass needle is aligning to the magnetic flow of the Earth's magnetic field. And that also aligns to a central north. So there's a lot of really good supporting evidence for the idea of a central north. That doesn't mean the AE projection is correct. We've already described some major issues with the underlying matrix or underlying measurements involved with that map itself. But the big point that I'm trying to make here is that if the far northern latitudes are so short around, and the far southern latitudes, especially when you get beyond 50 and 60 degrees south, those latitudes allegedly have no land masses. You know, like if you're in the north, if you're in the relatively far north, you have North America, you have Europe, Eurasia, Russia, China, uh, lots and lots and lots of land masses where, up until aviation, you couldn't circumnavigate using seafaring vessels through the central north. So people had to go way the heck around, around their elbow to get to their thumb, so to speak. And that's the reason why we see things like the Panama Canal built in the southern area in South America. It's because it creates a huge, huge shortcut so that seafaring vessels don't have to go the long way around, which is always, always, always going to be the southerly pass. Anytime you head towards the north, you're heading towards the center, and so it's necessarily a shortcut. Um, so we should see lots and lots and lots of people circumnavigating the far south in terms of east to west circumnavigation in the far south. And the best they can do is this periodical so called Antarctica Cup Challenge, which we've already mentioned. And this so called Antarctica Cup Challenge doesn't even go beyond the 45 degrees south, at least not for the entire time. That's proven because Fedor Konyakov had broken a world record, and he was, one of the guys that did the Antarctica Cup Challenge a few times, but he broke that world record by circumnavigating the world further south than 45 degrees south for the duration. And he even admitted to spending the majority of his time in the 50 degrees south. And if he would have gone past 60, not only would it have made his journey much, much, much too long, assuming a flat Earth with a central north, regardless of the accuracy of the Mercator projection, he would have stayed away from the 60 degrees south for several practical purposes, mainly because it's longer to go that way than it is to remain around the 40s and the 50s, and you'll be turned around by the entities which uphold the Antarctic Treaty, which claim that you're not allowed to free roam south of the 60-degree south latitude without express written permission, and you're only allowed to go to specific places in the Antarctic. And when you get there, you're not allowed to free roam. You're basically stuck at that base camp for the duration. And this is not conducive to scientific research that really truly is long overdue. A geodetic survey of the far south is long overdue, and the people who attempted such things in the 1600s and 1700s tried and tried and tried their damnedest to circumnavigate the far south in an east to west fashion, and they never could make their way around of it. And it has been computed that the average 45 degrees south isn't actually 42 nautical miles per degree of latitude or 48 statute miles per degree of latitude, but it is instead roughly 61 nautical miles per degree, or about 70 statute miles per degree at the 45 degrees south. And that's based on actual measurement of people who traveled from the far southern areas, being the southern tip of Australia to the southern tip of South America, to the southern tip of Africa, and around to the southern tip of Australia yet again. They computed that as being 22,000 statute miles, which is way too far wide around to be 45 degrees south on average if the Earth was a globe. And so there's just way too much evidence to support the idea of a circular layout. And whatever the sun may appear to be doing in the sky doesn't prove anything one way or another about the shape of the Earth or what's actually going on in the heavens. And frankly, neither do the stars, they're just lights in the sky. But I think it's safe to assert that if a person standing in North America faces north and sees the North Pole star, and a person in China or Russia also faces north, 12 hours later or whatever, and sees the North Pole star in their north, it really makes a lot of logical sense that the north is in the center of this map. Let's not forget the northern solstice, where the sun obviously goes around in apparent circles in the north near the Arctic Circle. And the footage from that, the footage from the northern solstice in the far north, appears to be legitimate and realistic. And on the other hand, the footage from the alleged southern solstice, so from the far south, the 24-hour sun in the far south, appears to be forged. It doesn't appear to be realistic whatsoever. Furthermore, regardless of what things look like, so let's just say hypothetically that the 24-hour sun in the far south is a true thing during the solstice. Let's just say that's true. Even if it's true, that in no way, shape, or form proves, indicates, or even alludes to the notion that the Earth itself is a sphere or has even any sort of curvature whatsoever. That's because observing celestial lights, which we don't know the source of, we don't know what they are, we don't know how far away they are, we don't know what the source of the light is. There's just so many things that we don't know about celestial lights. To say that the sun can and cannot do this on a flat Earth, or the sun can and cannot do that on a flat Earth, is preposterous. The sun is not necessarily a spherical object traveling overhead in circles or in linear paths. The sun appears to be a subjective phenomenon that is subjective to the eye of each beholder. And there are many variables that are going on in between whatever the source light of the sun may be and that light eventually reaching your eye. So I can show an example of a few things or describe a few things, but I think just the long and short of it is if you're trying to measure the size and the shape of let's say, a pool table, and that pool table is in the middle of a disco with a disco ball. If you've ever been around a disco ball, it shines lights all over the place. And your method to measure the either flatness or sphericity or curvature of that pool table, your method involved completely ignoring the pool table altogether, not even looking at that or measuring that whatsoever, but instead looking at the instances of reflected light on the ground, on the floor, on the walls, coming from the disco ball. That would be, sort of the globe Earth method of allegedly measuring or discerning whether or not the Earth is a sphere. It's the same exact principle. The Earth doesn't have curvature. That's demonstrable. It's measurable. Anybody can prove it. It's common sense. The Earth is also not in any sort of motion, and ditto for all that. It's common sense. Plain, simple physics 101, demonstrable, repeatable, factual, that the Earth doesn't move at all, doesn't spin around on an axis, certainly not at 1,000 miles an hour near the equator, certainly not the speed of sound, in Florida, and certainly not traveling around the sun through the theory of space time at some 66,600 miles an hour. All of this motion doesn't exist. And so to say that, again, and we're just hypothetically granting the far southern solstice 24-hour sun for argument's sake, that proves nothing. That holds no bearing on what's actually going on in terms of the shape or nature of the Earth. Again, it would be like measuring a pool table for curvature or shape and size, and instead of busting out a measuring tape and measuring the actual dimensions of the pool table, it would be like, again, trying to triangulate on the reflected lights coming from the disco ball. So I think that's a fairly good analogy, although it's not perfect. It's pretty accurate. You know, people claiming that the southern stars counter rotation, which has everything to do with atmospheric refraction or atmospheric lensing and absolutely nothing to do with the spin of the Earth. But so many people, so many globe earthers hang their hats on this apparent counter rotation of the southern stars. And something like that in a scientific venture where we're dealing with literally the most basic form of geometry, which again, geometry means measure the earth. So, the most basic form of geometry, as well as the most basic form of physics, which is the study of bodies in motion. So, the basic physics of the obviously stationary nature of the earth, all of this boils down to measurable stationary plane Earth. Yet you've got people who insist on pointing up at the stars and the sun and what they appear to be doing in order to prove the shape and nature of the Earth. And so the pool table analogy, I think, is a perfect analogy. Maybe I can come up with something better, but I think that pretty much gets it. Furthermore, when you see time lapse footage of the North Arctic sun doing its 24 hours of daylight, that appears to be legitimate footage, while similar footage in the South appears to be fraudulent. However, even if the midnight sun phenomenon is 100% true in the South, um, I would say that it's much, much different than it is in the North for a few reasons, but I would also say that it proves nothing about the curvature or lack thereof of the Earth, nor does it prove a thing about the alleged motion of the Earth, which doesn't exist. Um, you know, strange things that lights do in the sky prove absolutely nothing about the shape or nature of the world that we all live upon. That's one of the most difficult things for globeheads to wrap their brains around is the idea that because the moon looks as if it may be a sphere, that does not necessarily mean that the Earth is a sphere. Even if the moon is a sphere, that doesn't make the Earth a sphere. confirmation bias runs rampant in the heliocentric theory, and that's not by accident. We've all been very heavily indoctrinated and, yes, indeed, brainwashed into believing really quite absurd theory is scientifically proven fact. Example would be, I always use this one, the theory that we all live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere, standing perpendicular to the axis of this 4,000-mile radius spinning sphere, spinning well over the speed of sound at the equator, vertically falling around an inverse square just due to spinning around a parabolic curve at some 100 plus miles per hour compared to the tangent line for the base point squared. Not to mention the hyper ludicrous orbital values allegedly of the sun and the galaxy and the Big Bang and all the rest of the theoretical nonsense which we must believe hook, line, and sinker without any direct evidence, and yet for some reason we can't get 90% of the world to realize that the Earth does not have any curvature and it's also not moving at all, let alone spinning around at supersonic speeds near the equator and traveling along multiple conflicting curvilinear paths a gazillion miles an hour in several different directions simultaneously. If you believe that, then I suppose you would believe anything that NASA and the school system taught you. So I suppose you believe that gasoline or fossil fuels are made out of dead dinosaurs or fossils. It's been fairly conclusively proven that fossil fuels are not made out of dead dinosaurs because the wells that were said to have run dry in the 80s have been replenished. So, unless Doc Martin somehow figured out the flux capacitor and went back in time and murdered millions of dinosaurs somehow, then I highly doubt that the fossil fuels are made of dead dinosaurs and dead plankton and dead bacteria. That's a Rockefeller lie in order to cause the illusion of scarcity in order to drive up prices. Okay, so while I had originally intended to make this a 15-minute to 30-minute long video, obviously that I've failed miserably at that aspect of it. I've got quite a bit more content already recorded and quite a bit more work to do on this video, so I'm going to do this in sections. So consider this the end of section 1 and be on the lookout fairly quickly, I would say, probably before the end of July, hopefully, or maybe around the beginning of August for section 2 of this video to come out. So I'm going to start wrapping this up. First of all, I want to thank all of my patrons through Patreon. You guys are great. You can support this channel and my efforts in terms of the book and everything else that I do to try to help spread flat earth truth through Patreon, again, for as little as $1 per month at www.patreon.com/TheMorgile. Also, you can support this channel direct through PayPal, which is actually preferable because PayPal does not take a large sum. You can contact me at themorgile@gmail.com. That email is also linked to my PayPal account. The direct link to support through PayPal is www.paypal.me/themorgile1. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've used the email address jonelance@gmail.com for some time, which is still a valid email, but for some reason, and it may be nefarious or it may just be the millions of email users out there, but there is a JOHN elance at gmail.com out there who is not me. So if you've tried to email me at that address and never got a response, or perhaps got some kind of a rude response, I'm not sure, then that it wasn't me, as the song goes. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this section 1 of the video. Section 2 will probably be a little bit shorter, but seeing how I wanted to keep it under 30 minutes, I definitely think I should keep it under 2 hours. So with that being said, God bless you all. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening. And as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace.